I want to welcome everybody, and I see some familiar faces, but also some folks that I haven't gotten to meet yet. But my name is Brenda Allen, and I work at Iowa State University as a part of our Extension Professional Development Unit, but I have been I was a 4-H'er years ago in Iowa and a 4-H professional for 20 years, working with our civic engagement and leadership programming, as well as professional development for the last about 8 to 10 years, I would say. And I want to introduce my colleague, Erica, and let her share a little bit about herself as well.
Sure. Thanks so much, Brenda. My name is Erica Bonnet, and I am an extension specialist at Virginia Tech with Virginia Cooperative Extension. I work mostly in program and curriculum development, but I have actually worked in extension in 3 different states. I started my career in Texas as an agent, was an agent in Southeast Virginia, and then an agent in Indiana, and then a STEM specialist in Indiana. So I have been around 4-H for about 15 years, and I really am passionate about positive youth development.
And Erica, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and share screen because I realized we haven't done that yet, and introduce you all to our topic, and want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. We will be talking about ages and stages of positive youth development, and we are excited that you're here to have this discussion. We hope and have planned for an engaging session today. And so we'll be having some discussion based on our numbers. We are going to do some small groups, but we may do everything as a large group and make some modifications so that people can be a part of the conversation. As Eric and I shared in our introductions of ourselves, we both have a lot of background and experience in positive youth development and applying these concepts to both curriculum development and delivery. And so we look forward to sharing with you some of our expertise, as well as providing opportunities for us to learn together and hope us really to be more intentional about our work. That's really our goal. You can go ahead and advance. I want to share with you all, this next slide comes specifically from Iowa. I shared at the beginning that that's the state that I hail from. And this is a tool that we use in our state, and I think provides a good framework for this concept of positive youth development. As Eric and I talked, she said, yes, Brenda, we should include. We use this 4-H equation to help our staff connect the basic positive youth development concepts in regard to program planning and implementation. And I think it fits very well with our topic today of ages and stages as well. If you start at the very beginning, the reason that we do our work, why 4-H exists and our purpose goes back to helping young people meet those 4 basic needs of belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. The way that we do that has 2 very significant components. One is the context with which our work happens. So those are the essential elements. How do we structure things? How are we purposeful about size of groups, the amount of independence that we might provide, all of those components and things. So as you can see listed, our caring adult, safe environment, inclusiveness, mastery, self-determination, etc. We also help to provide or meet those needs through the content. So program priorities for us in Iowa, we've narrowed that to these 4 categories of STEM, healthy living, leadership and civic engagement, communication, and the arts. You may in your states use some slightly different program areas. But a result of that, in addition to meeting those needs at the beginning, is also our outcomes, productive citizens, what we're striving for. And again, in my respective state, what we measure for our outcome assessment is, are we developing productive citizens, outstanding communicators, effective leaders, and successful learners? That's what our goal is and where we're headed. But that can't happen if we don't first meet those needs at the very beginning of this equation through that content and context. Now, why is this relevant to ages and stages? Because that looks different for each of those ages and stages. The way that we might address that caring adult or safe environment is going to be modified slightly if we have 5 to 8-year-olds or we have 15 to 18-year-olds. The amount of independence that we can provide them, that voice and choice is very different. And so we will explore that through this session. But also, I guess, wanted to share with you how as we do positive youth development, it's good to come back to those core concepts and help our staff members, our volunteers, and others see that ages and stages isn't a new concept. It's connected to these other pieces of positive youth development that we do. And so this is one way that we do that in Iowa, and hope that that's helpful for you. And the basic idea too is, again, increasing intentionality. We do this work often all the time, but if we're not intentional about it, then we can also have some missteps. And so taking that moment to reflect, I think, is also important. And so, yes, go ahead and advance. And so now we'll move into more specifically our topic today of ages and stages of positive youth development. And you know that young people grow and develop. We all change. That's just whether, and that happens whether it's intentional or not. But there are some pieces both that are connected both to nurture and to nature. We are focusing today more on that nurture component. What do we have control over, and what are some influences to a child's growth and development? And as you can see from this list, everyone you can imagine that a child has contact with influences in some way their development, beginning with parents who often have the most influence, especially in a young person's early years of development, or whoever that guardian might be, through extended family members, which may be grandparents, aunts or uncles, cousins, but also caregivers, teachers, even their peers influence their development. And other factors, and the reason that we talk about this in our organization is that communities that we live in, the media, heredity, and environment also influence, and specifically those caring adults and volunteers that they work with, whether it's sports teams, faith organizations, or youth groups like 4-H. Go ahead. And so as we get into that philosophy of child development, there are several principles that we want to share today as some basic background and sort of truths that we are operating under. The first is that development is orderly, not random. It does happen in a sequence, and we will be looking at that sequence throughout today's lesson. Development is also continuous and gradual. We develop from the time we're born to the time that we die. We change, and both in terms of, as we get to some of those specific components, cognitively, the things that I learn and take in, but also you think about physically and how I may be more or less fit today than I was 2 years ago, or will be in 5 years, etc. It also is important to remember that there's a spectrum of where people are within each age group. And so as a 40-year-old, I may be at a different stage than my friend who's also in that same age group because of genetics, as well as because of some of the things that I'm doing in my life that impacts that. And that's true for our young people that we work with as well. Development is most rapid during the early stages of infancy. And if you think about how much a child changes from birth to 1 year old, and how excited we are about all of those firsts, and then sometimes things slow down a little bit, more gradual, and then there is a big uptick in adolescence, and we see fast changes as well. And so as we take a look at these 4 age groups, you'll be able to see some of those shifts in the pace of development as well. And so that's another piece to consider. One, not all children develop at the same rate. Not all children possess the same temperament. And so that impacts the way those changes happen. Development also occurs within a larger context. And so all of the influences that I mentioned on that last screen impact how a child develops in the different phases that we will look at. And development is a multifaceted concept. And so we'll go to the next slide to look at those different facets of development. And to understand child development, I want to reiterate that you don't have to have a degree in this specific subject matter. We know a lot of it from our own experiences, whether we're because we lived it, but also because some of us are parents, some of us are aunts or uncles, or just caring adults in people's lives. But there are also some basic concepts that you can learn that will help you to effectively communicate and work with children of all ages. And so today we're going to look at four different age groups of children, and we'll talk about that next, but also four different categories or areas that are a part of that development. So the first is physical, social, emotional, and then cognitive or intellectual development. Depending on the different theories that you use and the states that you're in as you do the work in ages and stages, some use the term cognitive development, others use intellectual, so we try to include both. But that physical development refers to the growth and maturation of the body. So I'm growing up, my motor skills change, those kinds of things. Social development is the interaction children have with others and their ability to function in a social setting. So think about that first preschool classroom, think about the baseball team, group of friends, those kinds of things. How do I learn to give and take? How do I learn to share my feelings? How do I learn to take turns? Are all a piece of that social development. Emotional development looks at how they handle their feelings and express their feelings in an appropriate way. And I can give a real concrete example of this. I remember back when I was at my brother's house with my nephew, who was 3, and he had really good language skills, which would fall probably more in that physical development or even cognitive intellectual development. But his emotional development may not have been quite at the same stage. And so at 3, he was upset with me and could say a very clear sentence, "Brenda, I hate you, please go home." Now that hurt significantly, but you have to think about that's where he was at emotionally. That didn't necessarily match his intellectual or his verbal and language skills. They were far advanced. And so sometimes when he would say things, I would maybe expect that he was at a higher level than he really was, but he couldn't cope in that way. And so those emotions came out, very, very clearly. And finally, and lastly, I've kind of already started to head toward that path, but cognitive or intellectual development is how they learn. So thinking about concrete learners, how they're processing information that they receive, things that they observe, those kinds of pieces are a part of that. You can go ahead. So we're going to look in depth today at these characteristics, and we've divided them into 4 age groups, 6 to 8-year-olds, 9 to 11, 12 to 14, and 15 to 18. We chose these ages specifically because they span the youth that we work with in 4-H. Knowing how kids develop will obviously help us to develop better programs specific to their needs. And we hope to address not only basic characteristics of development, but also spend some time exploring what that means for our program development and delivery. So now that you know this about a 6 to 8-year-old, what does that mean in terms of things that I need to plan for or consider in the structure of my program, the content of my program, those kinds of things? And how do we meet those needs through the activities and interactions we plan? How can we plan so youth have the greatest opportunities for success? Those will be some of the pieces that we are going to look at today. And we want to be really intentional about that. And as I said before, practice what we preach in terms of that experiential learning. And so I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Erica, who's going to take us into our first exercise.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for kind of getting us to the point where we're going to start doing some of that experiential learning process. And so the point of doing it this way is for a couple of reasons. One, we learn better together. And so there's the opportunity to really think through with your colleagues and your friends and who you're working with to kind of hit a larger idea with what we're doing. But it's also a great way to kind of put pencil to paper, or in this case, mouse to screen and fingers to keyboard, to be able to use different learning styles as we do this activity. So what we're going to do, and Brenda kind of alluded to this a second ago, we were going to do breakout rooms, but because we're in a smaller group, we're going to go ahead and just do this as a large group. So in a moment, I'm going to share a Jamboard, and I'll put the link in the chat. And with that, what you're going to do is we're going to go through with the Jamboard, and let me go ahead and switch up to my Jamboard.
And as she's doing that, I put those questions and information in the chat so that we don't lose that through our conversation too.
So is everyone seeing my Jamboard? Okay, so I'll share in one moment. I'll go ahead and do it now. The link to this Jamboard. What we're going to do using any of the side buttons, so you can use the pen, you can create a text box, you can use a sticky note, which is literally my favorite thing in the entire world because the world needs color and everything needs to be color coded. But we're going to create an image or a use of word cloud-ish type of work to describe the ages and stages of youth development, doing those physical, social, emotional, cognitive, and intellectual characteristics so that we are showing what it is to be a 6 to 8 year old. So you'll see the questions in the chat. So we're looking at the characteristics based on physical, social, emotional, cognitive, and intellectual. Then also, what skills do youth of this age have? What are their relationships like? What do they value? How do they communicate? What do they think about? And how do they process that information? And the goal is, one, for us to unmute mute our mics and talk to each other like we're in a group. Two, it's also for us to be as creative as we can as we describe this 6 to 8 year old. Okay, so we're going to give you, what do you say, Brenda, 3 to 5 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, so we're going to do 3 to 5 minutes, and we're going to try to describe our 6 to 8 year old on this Jamboard. So feel free to unmute. Don't be shy. If you can't unmute, type like you're driving a race car. Do whatever you would like. But let's discuss.
I think the 6 to 8 year olds are very much hands-on, like they have to be touching something, doing something with their hands.
As a mom, I have a 7-year-old and an almost 29-year-old, and yeah, they don't like to hear the directions. Let's just dive in.
I put one up that they're developing their large motor skills. So teaching them like cutting scissors, any of that kind of things, or even like jumping jacks when we do some of our physical activities, getting them familiar with their body and using it.
Oh, things where they can be silly and laugh.
I think of they look up to and really are still at that lovey stage with adults or others.
They're also still pretty susceptible to when things don't go right, or to, like end of the world when projects don't go the way they think they should, or if water spills on them or whatever. So.
Others you can think of. Yeah, Kim.
I just was putting one in about understanding what's real and unreal. I know it's sometimes situation with the news, they say that repetitive, they might not understand it's the same thing happening. They might think it's repetitive and get scared, but also, their imagination is so wonderful at this age that it is hard for them sometimes to pull the what's real from their imagination.
I also like about this age and appreciate, I've noticed with my daughter, their ability to still really have strong imaginative play. Like I can't even relate to the things that she will conjure up, but to remember that and to try to, utilize that more, even though maybe we're way past that as grownups.
I just put short attention span. Like activities cannot be long.
Definitely.
I feel
And
the
you
same.
should, yeah. They're very social too. They love to work with others. And then at this age, it usually doesn't matter if it's boys or girls. They just want to work with friends.
Anything else for this age?
I think science and STEM activities are still pretty magical and cool. Like, just combining two things and getting an explosion is pretty amazing.
Things with a wow factor. Like
Yeah.
it has a wow factor, like an owl like flying into the room or anything that has a wow factor is very exciting at this age.
I think of with that, and this maybe goes to that imagination that you were talking about, but there's still the, what do I want to call it? Like they still believe, whether that's in Santa Claus or with the explosions, there is a magicalness to things at that age.
You have so many really good post-it notes, so I'm not sure if this is actually on there, but they're still very attached to their mom and dad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anything else?
I just added one that they love to share or tell stories. You might be talking about something about butterflies, like, yeah, and they want to jump in and tell you something that they've done.
Yeah.
So factoring that time in sometimes is important, or a way to have them share it some other time.
And sometimes it has nothing to do with butterflies.
Right.
In this age group, I feel like they're in a way are almost easier to engage with because of these things where, a teenager is a little harder to like stimulate and, get their buy-in. And also they seem a little, I don't know if it's easier to discipline, but you can still like redirect them in a positive way by giving them jobs. And it's also interesting too, because you can really seek out the other things that are going on behind closed doors with them, because they like display so much of everything out in front of you.
And those are really good points.
Yeah, I was just thinking that might be a good transition to sharing some of what our research says. And I think Erica's going to take us to that.
Yeah, so if you can kind of see for characteristics, can you guys see my screen?
Yes. And now it's in the now it's in the presentation. Yep.
I should have just left it in the old one so I could switch back and forth. Okay, there we go. So for this age group, we touched on a lot of these. And so I'm just going to kind of go through them quickly. When we think about 6 through 8 year olds, we really think through like physical, like they're still growing, but they're growing slowly. They're learning to master physical skills. So we talked about that a little bit, how important it is to have some tactile function because they're still trying to get that fine motor skills down. And they can control large muscles better than small muscles. So back to that fine motor skills, like giving them a lot of tactile type things to do. to help build those fine motor skills, but also knowing that if you have them cutting paper, it might be a hot mess. And that's okay, because that's where they are at that time. So understanding their skills. Emotionally, some of the ones that I think have always been kind of jumped out to me is the self-centered. And I know when you read that, it sounds really negative, like, because when we say someone is self-centered, but it's really not meaning to be negative. It's just where they are emotionally growing. So they're starting to understand themselves, and really their world revolves very smallly around themselves, and now continue to grow as we go through the different ages and stages. They want adult approval. So when they do something, they want you to tell them that they did a good job, or they got things right. Like, they're not, it's one reason we don't do ribbons in this age group. I know that's always a discussion, like, they should just place them. Well, one of the reasons we do kind of everybody's a winner at this age group is they want approval. So if they don't get that approval, it is really difficult and can have some emotional side effects. And so really understanding where they are. They don't like punishment, so they're trying to avoid their punishment, and they're very sensitive to criticism. So as we kind of talk through, sometimes we like a hard love type thing. This is not the age group for hard love. This is the age group for hugs. And you did a great job. So when you're thinking through this, like, just kind of understanding where they are emotionally. Socially, they're learning to be friends, but they're still self-centered. So please understand that. There's probably going to be some fights over, this is my toy, or this is my activity, or she breathes on my paper. So like understanding where that is. They do fight, but then they make up just as quickly as they fight. And they'll start to separate boys and girls. So we'll start to see at the younger end of this, we'll see a lot of integrated boys and girls, but then as they get closer to that 8, 9, to transition to the 9-year-old group, we'll start to see them start to split out a little bit. They're very concrete. When we think about intellectual or cognitive, they're concrete thinkers. Like, they think black and white. So they think it's just like what they know is reality. They need single activities. So we're thinking through single activity learning, and they're interested in doing things. They're more interested in doing than in results. So this is a process group. So they want to do the process, and they don't care mostly if they get it, if they don't finish it. So again, a lot of these are generalized statements. So I know Brenda mentioned this in the beginning. It's really important to understand that not every kid is going to go through this in a cookie cutter way. And so there is the individualized understanding the child that's very important too, and where the child is. But this is some general information about, like, general overview for this age group. So what does that mean? And what I loved about our discussion just a few minutes ago is we talked about some of these things. So this part is going to be really easy for me to go through, because we talked about what that means for programming, because that's super important. Is why is that important to us? My favorite thing is so what. So you're telling me this, but what's the so what? So the so what is, this means probably messy with meals, arts, and crafts. How many of you, and you can either raise your hand, give me a thumbs up, smile, laugh, do this, I don't care. How many of you avoid glitter with 6 to 8-year-olds? Y'all are brave. Okay, I was gonna say.
I embrace it, but you have to be prepared. Like, what's your, where's the mess gonna be?
That's where my limit is. That my limit is glitter. I'm gonna be 100% honest. I'm all about mess, but no glitter. But it's going to be messy. You have to I like to say, you have to be good with the chaos with this age group, because it's not going to be this cookie cutter, everybody sits and quietly and does everything very neatly to the end. It's also a way that we have to understand that if you're doing a craft and it has cutting in it, it's probably not going to be straight if we have our kids do it. And that's okay. And so understanding where they're at, and that perfection is not where they're at right now. encouraging small group interaction. So we really want to make sure that they're interacting with each other, learning some of their communication skills, communicating their emotions, communicating when they're not happy. So they want to use the scissors. So instead of just stealing the scissors, have them say, hey, do you mind if I use the scissors? So these are all great skills that we can use within our program to help them grow during this time period. We're still in mixed gender activities. Be positive. So this goes back to the fact that they do not like negative or criticism. They want approval. And so be positive, say good things, like remind them what they're doing a good job. Plan activities that promote success.
And sorry to interrupt you, Erica, but with that, I guess a point that I want to make with that is because they care about your approval, if you are critical of something that they do, then they can very quickly at that stage, they'll make some decisions at that point. I'm not good at science or, you know, whatever that might be. And so they're still learning about themselves. So at that stage, and so we want to be more positive about, oh, you're trying this, or isn't this new or interesting? And let them get to some of that discernment later.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Brenda. That is absolutely right. Like this age group really needs that positive affirmation as they move through. Make sure we talked about this in our Jamboard session, plan short activities. So do not plan long activities. They don't have the attention span. Focus on process, not the final product. We also talked about that one. And also allow for exploration and inquiry. So I think this is so important because a lot of times we want very concrete activities for them, but the more we can create some exploration, the more opportunity there is for them to continue to grow and figure out new things. Going back to what Brenda said about what they're good at and what they're not good at, they're starting to expand what they know they could be good at that age. And so the more opportunity we give them for exploration and inquiry, the more tools we give them for the future. Brenda, anything else to add on that one? So let me ask you this question, and you can raise your hand or not raise your hand. You can unmute yourself. There's a small group, that would be great, or type in the chat. So what are some key things you should do when planning programs for this audience based on what we just talked about?
This is Kim. I know one thing I do if I'm doing more science or activities that require those skills like cutting, I usually try to use some teens or older youth to help as assistants or parents so that they can be more engaged and have support.
That's great, Kim. What else? What are some other ahas or takeaways that we can use within our program?
And maybe another way to think about it is things that you might be more intentional about as you think through what we've shared or talked about.
What came to mind for me was just being okay with a little bit of chaos and know that things might be noisy or messy or a little disorganized, but that's okay. So just to be prepared for that and expect it.
And I see in the chat box too, mix it up. So series of short activities, that idea of the attention span. So how do we can transition from one thing to the next. Don't create this really complex project or you'll start to lose them.
I think capitalizing on the caring adult by making a point to speak to each one and say good job and do that reassuring connection so that they are acknowledged. Probably with every age group too, though, I guess.
Yep. Yeah. But it's especially important here, I think. I also like that that idea to, what's your, we might call it a brain break or activity to, as Kim says, shake the sillies out, but that we do need some physical activity at different points. You can't just sit and listen for too long, I think is important. And then also, if it is important for your material to be a certain size or a particular way to be able to do the next step, then maybe that's something that you pre-prep was listed, and or allow plenty of time for those things. And the other side of that is don't get caught up in that it looks perfect. You know, is that perfection something that's important to me, or is it really critical to whatever it is that you're doing? Because it is good for them to start to practice those skills.
Yeah, and I think one of the things just to add to that is that at this age group, it's okay for it to not be perfect. And I think letting them really explore that is so awesome, because again, they really get in their feelings. They have a lot of emotion, and emotion regulation isn't really that at the front right now. And so really letting them just kind of figure things out themselves. I like to say my example of this is I was doing a program and we were all making birdhouses, and this kid just cut out five of his hands on cardboard and glued them together in not a house at all, and said, I can't wait to show my mom my birdhouse. And I was like, I can't wait for you to show your mom your birdhouse either. And so his mom later sent me a message and said he was so proud of his birdhouse. And so they hung it outside as a decoration. And so they talked it through and talked about it, how it wouldn't actually house a bird, but the birds would really like to look at it. And so maybe they'll fly near it and see it. And so he was really excited about that. So it might not have been what I thought he should have done, but it was definitely something that he got to be creative with.
And I also like Susan's follow-up comment about they have extra materials for when they, as she said, mess up. And again, we may not care, but there are times, going back to that emotional regulation, if there's some young people that even though we say it can be any way, they feel like, oh, it's not the way I want it, and there's a meltdown. And so one exercise can be Erica's suggestion too, of how do we reframe and help them move forward with what it is. But there are other times when we say, this isn't a battle that's worth fighting, or like, this isn't a time where I have to have that teachable moment. Let's let them start over, because they're still learning through that process too. And so group facilitation, you've got to figure out when those things are most important and when it's best to do this, and then I can help you this time, or we'll just try again, and however this turns out, it'll be great. Or you can choose between the two afterwards.
Absolutely. Those are great points. That's great discussion.
You know, before I was a mother and just a 4-H educator, I would have felt more internal pressure for the outcome to look nice and pretty, or, you know, to standards, so that when they went home and they showed their parents, the mom and dad would actually be impressed. But as a parent of a child that would make a 5-handed birdhouse, when she comes home with things like that, I feel more grateful to the educator that she was with, that allowed her to do what she wanted and let her be herself, as opposed to trying to make her do it inside the box. And so it's definitely like something you don't realize a parent might actually be grateful for, that an educator lets them do their own thing, to, you know, or be themselves within the parameters.
I have thought a lot about that issue because they talk about kids' interest in art or some other areas drops off so significantly, because sometimes, that teacher or caring adult presence corrects the work or does expect it to fit in a certain way. And if that person can't do that, then they've decided that's not a skill they have. And so I really question or ask myself, and encourage others to ask, who or why is that important? Who is that important to, and or why is that important, if they're excited?
And that's an important thing to be have that self-reflection with, because a lot of times 4-H agents are type A, and we can all say these things in theory. I'm not type A, I'm type D, but I think we can all nod our head and go, right. But when it comes down to it, can you let go and let them do that? Like, actually let them do it however they want. And that's hard for some people.
Yeah, and I am also not type A, but I think one of the things that I have learned the most from this, as I've been doing a lot of work around how do we get kids interested in STEM particularly, giving them the skills at 6 to 8 years old to think critically, to problem solve, to really think through some of those things that are not just step by step by step, and let it just be, really does help when they go to the next age group, because that's when in their schooling things are starting to become more list driven or objective driven based on state standards or what state standards are. And so really pushing the creativity at that 6 through 8 age group really does help them start to still have that creativity when they're getting in that next age group and the following age group and making decisions on what they're good at. Great. So this is really good discussion, but I want to move on to the next one because we want to get through all 4 of them. Okay. Brenda, is that you or is that me?
Me, but we'll, I think we can go ahead and start with the Jamboard again, and maybe we won't spend as much time brainstorming, but would like to do similar process. So as we think about the stage of youth development, that is a 9 to 11-year-old, and so those would be our juniors in most of our 4-H programs, as you think about in that structure or category. What do you see that's true for that group? And again, if you advance your Jamboard, if you opened it separately, feel free to put those Post-its up. Otherwise, share verbally. And I've been trying to collect some of those as people share so that we have the visual as well. What do you think of when you think of those physical pieces, components, social, emotional, and cognitive or intellectual? Who do they hang out with? What do they like to do? How do they like to learn? If you go back to the chat, you can see some of those questions to spark your thinking. And I see some folks already putting things in, becoming somewhat independent from their guardians. Yes, my niece, I was just out last week or 2 weeks ago, and she wants to go over to her friends' houses to play. And she was excited about how many play dates can she have this summer. And she was up to 10 different girls that she hoped she could have a play date with. Lots of energy, starting to question things and authority. Yes, they're starting to get taller. Those friendships and interested in joining, whether it's a formal group or an informal group. I remember I was in a club with 3 other friends. We lived in the same neighborhood and we created our own little club after school. We'd get together and eat our popsicles, and we made up a name for ourselves. I won't share that because it was pretty silly. But yes, that is something that's connected. And open your mics and talk too. I'm talking because you're putting things up here, but I'd love to hear your voices.
Now, along with the friendships, that they really start to segregate into boys or girls. There's some exceptions, but primarily you'll start to see that they want to work with their friends that are girls or their friends that are boys in general, with some exceptions to that, of course.
Yeah, they're starting to understand gender identity, who they might be, and what that means, and what some of our societal expectations are around that.
Or sometimes for the girls, since they're maturing faster than the boys, at least socially, they think the boys are annoying, so they don't want to hang with them. They want to.
Yep. Yeah, I like uncomfortable with their growing or changing bodies. They're starting to get more self-conscious about what they wear at this stage, as well as a part of that process.
I think one thing I noticed, I have a newly minted 9-year-old, and interest in kind of planning ahead and saving money, actually. Like, I got this and this for my birthday and I want to save this for. So I don't know whether that's typical for this age, but it seems like it. It seemed like a really strong shift when I heard and saw him doing that.
Well, they're starting to understand what money is, or like what the cost or expense is of some things. Like, making that transition. It's not just I want this, but they understand that some things are expensive versus gum might be a cheap item, or that kind of thing. I noticed someone put up to greater sense of the competitive outcomes. I think of board games, and how many of our board games, they start to shift at that that they are for 8 or 9 years and up, where there is strategy involved versus something more simple like Candyland or Cheerio, Hi-Ho Cheerio. At this stage, it could be the game of life, or trying to think of others that I've played recently, Sorry, or that kind of thing, where there's you have to think through and make some decisions too. Their focus is growing, like how long they can be attentive to a project.
I think they're not growing at the same rate. So we see some differences in between those that identify as girls and those that identify as boys.
Erica, I think we'll go ahead and yes, and the last comment that I'll highlight here is better fine motor skills, so they're more adept at activities. I think this is a good list to start, and so let's go ahead and shift back, and we'll cover some of the pieces that we'd like to highlight, and with that also get to that application piece that we think is so important too. So as we look at those 9 to 11-year-olds, or that age group, you can tell physical development is beginning to pick up, and you shared that, and that it is not all at the same rate. Typically, we start to see females developing a little faster than males. Often a growth spurt happens during this time as they're moving closer to adolescence. But by age 11, some girls have started to be in menarche, or starting menstruation. Socially, 9 to 11-year-olds, they would prefer, it's all about the same sex in terms of groups, typically, and based on where they identify. This is also the age where they do enjoy being involved in clubs or groups. We talked a little bit about that association, that I'm connected to something, a team. That's when Little League often starts, or they're a part of some of those kinds of things as well. Not only 4-H, but Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, that while there are some there are opportunities for that K through 3rd grade. It really picks up at this 4th through 6th grade level, and that's when often our highest membership is too. So that's something that we're right in line with. This age group still has some difficulty seeing the views of others, but at the same time, they like to make others happy still, and so they'll adapt to some extent, even though they may not fully understand, what that's about. They also like to complete projects, and they do this often to please adults. They're still looking for that approval to some degree. At this age, children can sometimes start to be described as moody. We see that even more probably in the next phase, but their emotions, are starting to ramp up a little bit. They tend to have a weak sense of individual identity, and will often mimic what others are doing instead of just being themselves. And I have heard around some of those kids, things that they're hearing on TV by those sports athletes that are really popular, or that kind of thing. What was the dance that I forget what it's called now, but those elementary kids are the ones that could do it the best, and all kinds of viral videos. They want everything to be fair or equal, and they don't always understand that fair isn't necessarily the same as equal. And so explaining that we have different needs, or helping, if my brother who's 12 gets something, then I should have the same thing at 8, even though there are reasons why that might not be the same. They're beginning to develop a need to feel a part of something important. They do get doing things for others at this stage, and they may also, and this came up on the sheet from some of you, they may start to question authority, but at the same time, they still want some guidance from adults. They'll be looking to us, am I doing it right? But if they've learned from mom something different than what the teacher says, that's a juxtaposition that they're struggling with and trying to figure out what that means. Intellectually, they still in large part see things as black and white, but as they get older, at that 11, 12 years old, they're beginning to understand new ideas and start to think more abstractly. They're starting to identify favorite subjects at this stage and learning some of their interests. They also want to find their own solutions to problems instead of relying on others to help them. No, I can do it. You've probably heard from some of your own kids at this stage. Whereas, and we see that on and off throughout many ages, but it's definitely here. They want to assert that independence. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so what does that mean for the work that we do? As we work with this age group, some things we really want to do or that can help them to develop these skills can include providing active learning experiences. This means hands-on or activities where they are up and moving, because they do still have their ability to sit and focus is better than those younger kids, but they still need some transition and not just sitting and listening to lecture. Kids at this age are also beginning to be more competitive, which we talked about, and often by gender. So with that, my advice is avoid competition between gender groups. Don't divide kids, boys versus girls. One, because there may be some questioning of gender for some young people as well. And so encourage activities in a mix of groups so that it doesn't become this I'm better than you. Because if you also remember those physical changes, the girls are sometimes developing at a different rate than boys. And so some of that athletic ability or clumsiness, there's a different word that I have lost right now. You know, when you have too much coming in right now, but they don't have that, those motor skills at the same speed, maybe. We also want to think about, as we work with this age group, it can be okay, especially when we're having teamwork or discussion, you can divide them in same-sex groups because they may be more comfortable and participate better. You just don't want to make it a competition between the two, is what I want to focus on there. And we can also encourage their social development through involving older youth to be mentors for this age group because they look up to them and will follow that modeled behavior. And as we work with them, we can help them develop intellectually by providing simple, short directions and keeping learning experiences still at a brief stage. Provide a variety of different activities that will ensure some success for each child. That may look a little different for each of them, but taking that time to plan, the results will be worth it. Finally, it's important for us to remember to not compare youth to each other, but instead to recognize each child for their strengths and the things that they do well. We can place emphasis on progress they make as they progress through a task or work on whatever that 4-H project is. So understand that there are some limitations still by their developmental capacities, and organizing those events and activities that are age appropriate. Encourage active involvement rather than competition. Would be some other key things. And we're still at a point, and I think it was Dessa that said this earlier, all ages need some praise, but this stage still be generous with that and continue to encourage that exploration because they are starting to get a sense of what they might be interested in. And finally, I guess I want to highlight, provide clear rules, boundaries, and structure. They will be looking to us as adults to provide that. And they will test it. They'll start to go, so at what point will that be stopped? Or what is that behavior expectation? And so we can help with that in our consistency as well. You can go ahead and move to the next slide, and we want to now open it up to you. So as I shared and synthesized some of what was already on the board, but some other ideas, as you think through that, what are some key things that you should do or would do when planning programs for this audience, that 9 to 11 years old, based on some of the components that we talked about with physical, emotional, social, and that cognitive or intellectual development.
I know I like to use this group when I do a lot of project-based learning, that they can, to some extent, self-select groups, but sometimes you do have to move them around if there might be some, issues and stuff with personalities, but otherwise kind of let them select if they want to work with a girl group or a boy group or, group of friends, but then they can get into those fine details, longer attention, and kind of come up with a project at the end.
Any other thoughts?
I really like the tip about pointing out what they're good at and strengths. That's probably something that could be one of those life-changing moments from a caring adult, to hear that they are good at something and then really help them realize that and identify that and build upon that.
Yeah, thank you.
I also think training teens as teachers to work directly with this group and identify their strengths is such a powerful moment for our program, because we have both audiences. Because if you think about, like, and I know I can think about someone that was really beneficial and like I wanted to be when I was 9 or 10 years old, it was a lot of the older kids that I was around, either within my 4-H program or something like that. And so really using teens in that atmosphere is such an opportunity with our programs.
I think we even lose sight of that as all the age groups, because I think I would like to be told things that I'm good at from other people, because then I think like, okay, good, thank you. Because I think even when we get grown, we're adults, we get insecure and we don't think like we're good at any particular thing. And so, especially in 4-H, because you have to do a lot of everything. And so I think it'd be neat if we could get back into a culture of praising other people.
I know another thing I like to do with sometimes evaluation is use like relay races or something that includes activity, because then after you're doing something, they still have abundant energy to run around. And it's a way for them to get it out. So whether it's taking everything from one end to put it in the correct boxes or whatever at the other end of the room, or a relay team, just to find ways that they can get active.
Touching back on the Teens as Teachers, I really love that program. And one thing that we do with the students that they're teaching is to have agreements at the beginning. The first day is to create an agreements poster where the teens have already decided in their training what things they think are important. Then we allow the younger students to add to it. But some of the things that come up is just keep your hands to yourself. It is like things like that are really simple that we might not think of putting there, but when the children contribute to that list, they come up with things that are important for them to feel safe. And then we use that list throughout the sessions for the teens to praise based on behavior. So rather than calling out a kid that's not following it the first time, they'll find someone at the same table to praise for doing it correctly. And generally that works right off the bat. But if it doesn't after that sort of reminder, then we'll go to that child and say, hey, just want to remind you about our agreements. Do we need to review them? And usually they'll go, no, I got it. And that solves it. But it starts with the praising. And I love to see the teens do this, because then the younger kids are totally like clued into, oh my gosh, they're paying attention to me, whether it's positive or negative, they know that the teens are watching. So I've had good results.
Thank you for that, Susan. And yes, I mean, it would totally make their day to have gotten that praise or that connection, I think, from that older youth. In the interest of time, this is great discussion, but I want us to be sure to get through the last 2 stages in some capacity. So I'm going to turn things now over to Erica as we explore those 12 to 14-year-olds, the next stage.
I didn't turn my mic on. Okay, so we're going to go back to the Jamboard and go to this one. And this is kind of be speed Jamboarding, because like any other good program, we're getting closer to the end and we still have lots to get through. So we're going to call this speed Jamboarding, 1 to 2 minutes. And so what I'd like you to do is just focus for 1 to 2 minutes and get as many sticky notes as you can onto the board about the characteristics of 12 to 14-year-olds. And just a reminder, this is my favorite age group. About 73 seconds left. Here they come. $62.5 seconds left. $33 seconds left. $15.8 seconds left. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Anybody feel really pressured right now? Okay, so I'm just going to go through a few of these and then we'll go into some discussion. So some of the things that you guys are saying, our physical appearance is changing, which is so true right for this age group. They have a strong sense of justice and equality. They're also, and I just want to add to this, they're also really trying at this age to start seeing where social change is needed. So not only justice and equality, but they really are starting to see social change issues and are very open to those. They value independence, even though they might not be ready for complete independence, they think they are. They need to be part of the decision-making process for buy-in. They're moody. We should like ostracize this, capitalize it, put like lines under it. Moody and this age group is a very good word for that. They love talking about themselves and exploring their interests. They're sensitive, lots of physical change, care about others' opinions of them. Their peer group is super important. They need more in that intellectual stimulating activities that matter to them. And the instructions must be straight to the point, but they also need guidance and reminders. So yeah, absolutely. These are awesome. And they fit on a lot of the ones we're going to talk about. So let me pull the slide back up. So for this age group, this is a lot of the things that you already hit. So there's so many physical changes happening for 12 to 14-year-olds. Just they're growing, their bodies are developing, everything is kind of happening at once. And when we talk about moodiness, that's where it comes from. Not only are their bodies developing, but their emotions are developing. There is a lot going on for such a young person at that time. And so I joke when I say they're moody, and they are moody, but they also, there's a reason why they're moody. So it's not just, they're just moody to be moody. Towards the end, you'll start to see a little bit of slower development. For social, they're looking for activities that are mixed gender. They're starting to have their first crush. They want to be around boys or girls or people that are different than them. They are starting to kind of like the opposite sex. They look more to their peers and their parents. This is where teens are such an important part because they see teens as a really cool peer. And so a lot of times adults are not cool anymore, but their peers are still really cool. They're looking for adult role models and fan clubs. They really want to kind of fit in. They want people that they can be like, oh, I want to be like them. This can be both positive and negative as we think about like how they're interacting with the world, and what their social experience is and what those adults might look like and be doing. They tend to reject solutions from adults in the favor of their own. I love this because they could be completely wrong, but they still will guarantee you that they're right. And so how do you as an adult like balance that out? And so that's working with this age group. I like to call it the herding cat mentality. So like you're trying to figure out what's going on with them, but then they scratch you. And then the next thing they do is they jump in your arms and love you. And so you have to be okay with like going with the flow and understanding where they are emotionally. So emotionally, they compare themselves to others. They see themselves as always on center stage. They're in the middle, they're focused with themselves. They want autonomy. And this is a hard one because they need to start getting some independence and autonomy, but they still need some guidance. And so really finding that balance for this age group emotionally is very important. Their emotions are all over the place. So they're happy one minute, they're sad another. A lot of this is from their growth and everything. It's also with what the world's telling them, and they aren't thinking completely abstract yet. So they're kind of in that middle between like concrete and abstract thinking. And so they're seeing what the world is saying. So they're watching social media, they're TikToking, they're on Snapchat, and that is driving their emotions because that's the world that they're seeing. And so understanding that balance. And I think for us as educators, and I'll talk about this a little more when we think through application, the mix of technology for Generation Z is all new for us. Like this generation is so ingrained in technology. We have to be able to kind of weave that into our ages and stages of positive youth development as we think that through. Intellectually, they're gaining study skills. They're starting to care about school or not care about school. They're learning to abstract think. So they're kind of moving from concrete to abstract thinking. They're ready for in-depth and long-term experiences. This is where a lot of the sustainable learning really needs to start to take place. This is where a lot of the sustained experiences that get them interested in careers and opportunities really should focus on. And they like to set goals based on their needs. So they're starting to move from fantasy to realistic focus on their life goals. So not everyone is going to want to be a firefighter anymore. Or not everyone is going to be, so they're going to start to see their career shift, especially when they get up to closer to that 14 age. So what does that mean for us? So that means we need to be willing to answer questions. So be able to be open and be able to answer questions as they come or figure out ways to get them answers. Avoid comments that criticize or compare you physically. So this is probably the most important for this age group. This age group is really trying to figure out who they are, and they're very self-conscious, especially girls. And so we really need to make sure that we're not comparing youth and we're not criticizing them physically because they're still trying to figure out who they are. And figuring out who they are is really tough at this age. Let them plan their own programs. Give them the chance to plan a program, to be involved in the planning process, to be the active voice. Create programs and areas where peer support is important. So they're using peer check-in processes. They're doing teamwork based on peer check-in processes. So there is that peer support, and emphasize personal development. So not only emphasize the content, but really focusing on that personal development, life skill development, some of those soft skill development within programs. Let teens assume responsibility. We kind of talked about that. Help them explore identity, values, and beliefs. Give them a safe space. So one of the things that I like to use is the term safe space, brave space. So these are places that are safe for teens and preteens to start to think about things that matter to them. So I mentioned earlier that it really is important, like social issues are really important. Like if you think about Greta, the environmentalist, she's 13 and we saw how much like change she could literally make. And so really understanding that is important to this age group of youth. They are starting to get passionate about different topics and social issues that they are passionate about. And so helping them explore that. There we go. I was like, I'm not going to pronounce her last name because I'm going to mess it up. Help them develop their individual skills, encourage youth and adults working together. And I'm going to put an asterisk by this because a lot of times when we do youth adult partnerships, we do adult driven youth partnerships. And so it's really important that as we're setting these up, that we really are letting youth, especially starting at this age and going on to our teens, drive those partnerships, drive those interactions. And this is about being able to let go a little bit. And this is about, we're going to go back to our 6 to 8 year olds and let it be messy because it might be messy. So understanding that we need to let go a little bit of the control. Make sure that when you're designing programs, they have real life problems to solve. This is very important for females or those that identify as female, because especially when we come into STEM, they don't want to do a problem to just do a problem. I like to call it the train problem. They do not care how long it takes, what time the train's coming, as part of that train math problem. Like if it left Colorado and it's going to New York, how long does it take? They don't care. But they do want to solve real world problems, things that they can actually see and connect with. Encourage service learning. So this is a great way to also do that through service learning. And then start to plan career exploration activities. Add in career exploration as part of all of our programming ideas. So what are some keys, things you would do, you are thinking about when it's planning programs for this audience? What are some key aha moments or ideas?
I know this is the main target age for our Explore UMass. When we bring them to campus to do some of those explorations, they get a little independence away from home. They work in their team. So this is one of the age groups we target that. I work more on the state level, so that's one of the things we do.
Absolutely.
I think they're ready at this age to start doing some things outside of their class, or so that they do get to start to meet some other people. So some of those camps or county-wide events that can be cool to start building other relationships and to find people that maybe have some connections to them that they may not be getting other places.
This is also a fun time where they can start feeling the mastery elements, and like we mentioned before, where they get to plan programs and have that ownership in those life skills that will really continue with them.
Yeah, this is the age group where sustained learning is so important as we're thinking through like connections. Absolutely. Okay, Brenda, you want to move on to the next one since we're running?
Yeah, and you don't need to go to the Jamboard. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. So we're going to talk about 15 to 18-year-olds. And in the interest of time, and go ahead and click again, because I didn't remember that I did an animation there. So we pull up everything. Oops, went one too many. So as you look at the characteristics of our 15 to 18-year-olds, things such as concerned about body image, exhibit maybe a smaller range in size and maturity among peers, like they're starting to catch up with one another at this stage, essentially. But they do, and they start to have a little bit more realistic understanding of their limits of what their body can do. Like I may start to focus and say, I'm only going to do basketball because I have that, but I'm not as good at volleyball as I once was, or, narrowing those interests a little bit based on what my skills or that sort of thing. Socially, they are starting to explore sexuality at this age, and that can mean a lot of different things. And this is an area where there is a much greater range because there are lots of influences about that, but they're starting to experience attraction. They may have already started to have that as 12 to 14, but it's really at high buzz level in this area. They are making commitments and can be expected to follow through. They desire respect. They want some of those adult leadership roles, as you see, and they desire that respect. And that can come across in a lot of different ways. They're starting to develop their own set of values and beliefs, and they may or may not be the same as their parents. They're starting to distinguish and understand what they personally feel, and may even get into some discussions or disagreements with friends or family members, etc. Starting to develop a little more independence and maybe even thinking about who their friends really are based on some of those beliefs or values at this stage. They are mastering abstract thinking and enjoy demonstrating their acquired knowledge, like to be asked to help with things and show some of those skills, be called on as a leader. They'll lose patience with meaningless activities. So if you say, I'm asking for youth input, but all you do is have me sit at the meeting and I don't actually get to say anything, then I'm going to quit coming to the meeting because I have better things to do with my time. I have to work. I have other requests. So as you look at these characteristics, before we go to the next slide, what do you think of as things that you would be purposeful about in your planning? I'm going to switch it up this time. And as you look at this, what are things that you would think about in terms of program implications?
I know we tap a lot of this age group to help lead workshops, like at winter workshops and things like that for the younger youth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're ready for taking on that leadership and can give those directions, provide that support. Other things that you might be purposeful about. When you think of our 15 to 18-year-olds.
Making sure that they have a voice in the planning process of the event that you're doing.
Absolutely, yes.
This is going to sound silly, but I always find it hard to make eye contact with this age group. I don't know if it's because of the physical changes are so strong, but to really make a point to connect and make that eye contact and really make them feel like you hear them as opposed to just kind of glazing over them.
Thanks. And that makes me think of something that I guess I've found real success in with this age group that maybe goes with that is getting to know something about them beyond whatever our programming is, because then that can build some rapport. So then when I'm trying to, maybe it's get them back on task or even to capitalize on those skills. So having some conversations and demonstrating to them that I see your skill and see you as more than a kid, so to speak, that I know you have interests. And so, whatever that might be, that I can build that rapport has helped me. Wendy is talking about deeply reflecting on activities so that they think about, what does this mean? And I think that's a good segue. Let's go ahead and transition to the next slide. And so some of the things that I would reiterate based on the research, as well as some of what you said, be willing to answer questions. They do start to, they're exploring some things, and some of that can be about their physical development, but it can also be about some of the things that are happening politically, some of those social change things, and they're interested in others' perspectives. And/or they may make a comment about that. And so we need to be prepared to expand what those different thoughts are. Thanks for sharing that. And I want to also share this in case people, have heard other research about that. This was mentioned by one of you before, but letting them plan their own programs, and they really can follow through. And then also having them experience whatever those consequences are and processing. But that goes back to that reflection that Wendy says, provide a space to talk about. So how did it go? And what would I do differently? And when you're working with youth and adults together, the adults don't just do it and ask the young person to be the helper, but that it is really a discussion about and a give and take on both sides. And that it also isn't just that the adult thinks, well, we're working together, I'm just sitting back and watching the young person do it, but that demonstration of respect by saying, well, I see it differently, and let's talk about that. Giving them those real life problems to solve. So it needs to be, this was mentioned in the 12 to 14, but I want to reiterate here too, that it's meaningful and that they see how this is connected, and that it's, you see it encourage service learning, that they see how this impacts the greater good as well, would be some that I would like to highlight. We'll go ahead and move forward. And I know we spent less time on these last two ages, but it's because I also want to, before we wrap up, at least highlight and give us some brief time to talk about, so what do we do with this information? And so you can go ahead and go to the next slide too. We won't get into small groups to do this, but I do want you to think about a program that you have scheduled maybe in the next couple of months. What age are you most likely to work with? What would you need to do or consider or watch for as a leader to ensure it's a positive experience for that youth based on their age and stage? And really think about what are realistic outcomes that you might want to achieve with that group. And what are those appropriate structures that you need to put in place? So as we think about, if I'm working with that 6 to 8 year old and all of those needs that they had related to their motor skills and such, my youth adult ratio needs to be much smaller than my 15 to 18 year olds, that I can allow them to have some more independence, those kinds of things. Erica, I'm going to shift, and I think you have the ability to share screen. Do you want to show them that planning tool that I'm going to put in the chat box as well? But if we pull it up as a resource as I do that, I think that would be good. So Erica is sharing with you a piece that we have used in Iowa, and then I want to encourage us to think about as a tool, pulling my cursor in the right place so I can put it in the chat, to increase our intentionality. So this is a planning tool that asks some of those same questions. So as we go back to what was on the slide of what's that age group that I might be thinking about, what's the program priority? So am I doing a STEM activity? Is it the day camp? What's my plan? What do I need to consider about this particular group and those needs based on their physical, social, emotional, cognitive? And so how does that affect my program design? We have lots of different program planning tools, but this is maybe something that I'd encourage you to do at least once, to come at it from that ages and stages perspective, so that you can then think about how you might integrate that into great other program planning that you do, because it's just a different framework that we don't always take the time to be intentional about. And as I pull up the other resource to share that link, as you look at this document and you think about that program planning, any thoughts or immediate considerations that came to your mind that you want to share?
I think one for me is as I know everyone is just trying to unmute their mic. So as you're unmuting your mic, one that is for me is intentionality. So these are things that we do, but being extremely intentional and really focusing in on what age group we're working with, and not doing it just the way it's always been done. I think intentionality is something that I think is very important as we move forward.
Yeah, for me, I mostly work with 12 to 14-year-olds, and I feel like I always need to find a way for them to connect directly with the topic. Otherwise, they're not going to care. They're going to be like, why is this useful for me? So find an application for their life and really allow them to explore those interests as well.
Thanks. Erica, you can go ahead and switch back to the PowerPoint if you would. And I want to share with you, so in the chat, I put the link to that program planning tool that you have access to if that's something that you'd like to use. I also put the link to an Ages and Stages document from Erica that they've used through the Virginia Cooperative System and elsewhere. And we have included some other resources here that helped us to guide our programming. So you have the materials on Ages and Stages that we use out of the state of Iowa for our 4-H, specifically that we've provided to our new volunteers, but is true, you know, for all of us. The one that Erica provided, its original home, I think, came from Purdue University. And so we want to give credit where credit's due. And then there are also some Ages and Stages materials on the National 4-H page. And so want to share that with you. I also, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I did include in the chat, I've just included the link to our slides as a PDF, so that if you want to go back and double check those web links more closely, or even just find those details, then that we have those provided. We are getting close to the end of our time, and so I do want to remind you that the NAE 4-H YDP teaching and learning work group has 2 more sessions this summer. And so one is July 8th, and you'll get to see Erica and I again, focusing on learners designing programs to meet audience needs. And so we'll be building on what we talked about with Ages and Stages, you know, in that session too. And then the last one is July 15th on work-life integration. And I think Erica's going to close us out.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We know that it went fast and furious, and thanks for holding with us as we change things up since we're a smaller group today. But if you have questions or want to reach out to us, both Brenda and I have provided our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us, ask us questions. This is a topic that we're very passionate about, and we're really excited to see how you're going to use it within your communities.
And I do want to point out, Anna Karen did share that the evaluation has been, the link for the evaluation has also been posted in the chat, and we would love your feedback, both for us individually as presenters, but also for this group, the Teaching and Learning Working Group, as we think about sessions that we might do in the future. So thanks for that as well. If nothing else, we'll stay on for a few minutes in case there are private or more general questions that you want to ask or that kind of thing. But we also know that the time frame for this is to end at 4 or 4 Central is where I'm at, but on the hour. So I want to thank you for your engagement today.
Thanks, guys, for joining us.
Thank you.
And I think you can stop the recording, Erica, even though we are going to stick on in case there is anything else.